Well, Alberta is calling and Canadians are certainly answering. Enticed by Alberta's affordable cost of living and opportunity, thousands of people are moving to the province to make their home and their living here. And this is injecting much needed positivity into the province. And while affordability and opportunity are attracting people to the province and businesses are very optimistic about our economic future, there are a few things that we need to address in order to make this short-term success translate into long-term growth and prosperity. Hey there, you're listening to the Brief and Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host Scott Crockett and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. And we're back with BCA's economics team, Mike Holden and Alicia Planincic, to break down the spring 2023 update of the Alberta Snapshot, all-point summary of Alberta's economy. And the discussion board this time includes Alberta's economic outlook, the state of business in the province, the battle against inflation, wage growth, housing, and what we can expect in the coming months to ensure that Alberta remains an affordable place to live and work. And if you found this episode interesting or insightful, please let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show. Okay, so the economy is something that everyone loves to talk about, but rarely understands how it works. And that's why I think these conversations that we have every quarter around what's happening in Alberta's economy and Canada's economy is really important and insightful. And so we're back with BCA's economics team to talk about what's happened in Alberta and Canada since our last update in January and just share some insights on what's happening right now. So as we enter the second quarter of the year, can you both just give us your 30,000 foot view of what's happening in the economy, both from the Albertan perspective and as well as from the Canadian perspective?
Sure. So pretty quickly, in a nutshell, I would say nationally, three things: tight labor markets, high but moderating inflation, and uncertain economic growth in the year ahead, but likely to slow down. Taking that back for the Alberta perspective on the tight labor markets, I would say yes, but not as strong in Alberta for reasons we'll talk about in a minute. On high but moderating inflation, I would say yes, and a little bit more so, actually, thanks to some policy moves we've seen in the province. And on that third point of slowing economic growth, the good news is a little bit less so the case in Alberta. We're likely to see the recent forecast something like 2% economic growth. Certainly nothing to write home about, but better than 0% that we're seeing in other provinces.
Okay, let's get into some of the more nuanced aspects of the quarterly economic snapshot that you folks have put out. Everywhere we're seeing signs of what sounds like a slowing economy, or we've been hearing that in a lot of headlines. But for Canada overall, the latest forecasts appear to look somewhat rosier. What are the economic projections telling us?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that the projections themselves, the banks, the Bank of Canada, even just a couple of days ago, put out its most recent forecast for the economy, and there's this general sense, this expectation that 2023 is going to be a year where we see a mild recession potentially. There's this idea of whether hopefully it's going to be a soft landing and pretty minimal economic growth. And we've been saying that, and economists have been expecting it or talking about it for at least the last 6 months based on the increase in interest rates that's been going on over that time period. But we're not seeing a lot of evidence of that slowdown happening yet. And I think that's the issue we've got right now. So if you looked at the monthly GDP numbers for January and for February, they're far higher than anybody had expected. I think like 6.2% in January and about half of that in February, which is still really strong annualized growth numbers. And so we keep talking about how it's going to be a slow, flat year, but it hasn't happened yet. And so we're still carrying on with a bit more strength in the national economy than people had expected.
And here's the kind of more complicated question behind this and what Mike's talking about, which is a slowing economy a good thing? That is something that the Bank of Canada is hoping for and is expecting to see. They want to see the economy slow down so that price growth then slows as well. And we're not seeing that. So the challenge that this raises for the Bank of Canada is it might mean another rate hike later this year if we don't start to see consumer spending slow.
Right, which, to some people listening, including me, sounds a little bit like craziness when you think of the number of rate hikes that we've seen in a row already, the fact that you haven't seen even the full effect of those. And despite what you've been saying about, strong economic numbers, it seems like the edge is really, starting to come off inflation, maybe even more than the edge. I think we've seen a number of months in a row where the month-over-month inflation target or numbers are way closer to target. What's your view of that?
So very true. The challenge is a lot of what's coming down is goods inflation. So the products that we buy, those things are becoming, I don't want to say less expensive, but their prices aren't growing as fast, which is good. The reason for that, though, is nothing to do with the Bank of Canada. It's the fact that energy prices have come down a bit. It's the fact that supply chains have worked themselves out. Services, however, has not come down as much. That's really what's keeping the Bank of Canada up at night. So it's, when you go to the coffee shop and notice that the price of coffee is going up, right? And so these types of things, that's really what worries the Bank of Canada and is why they're trying to increase rates to slow down consumer spending, to bring what they say demand in line with supply so that we're not kind of overheating.
It's funny you mentioned coffee because there are always these things that stick out in your mind. And for me, it was Americanos. I was like, hey, man, that's like a specialty coffee priced beverage now. And I don't know, for some reason, that's my personal inflation barometer. Okay, if that's the Canadian look, though, let's zoom in on Alberta a little bit. Alberta appears to be maybe even a little bit stronger than most. What are you seeing in terms of Alberta within Canada?
Well, I think as Lish said earlier on, we've got a situation here where Alberta is in a position to do better than pretty much the rest of the country in this year and next year. And, there are two main reasons for that. One is the obvious one in a sense, and that's that oil and gas prices are high. We're seeing lots of production activity, and it's an energy sector story again that's driving the difference between Alberta and the rest of the country. That's one component of it, and the second one is population growth. And so we're seeing a lot of people moving to Alberta. We're seeing the population is increasing, and as that happens, that's also fueling economic growth because there are more people here with a job earning money.
Right. And I think a lot of people moving to Alberta is maybe even like an understatement of it, like historic numbers, or at least numbers we haven't seen in a couple of decades. So what does all this mean for business? We're a business organization. What does the economic conditions that we're looking at mean for things like investment, labor and hiring, business creation? What are we seeing there? What are we going to see there?
So yeah, every few months we survey our members in what we call a business expectation survey, which was very similar to what's done nationally by the Bank of Canada. And we just asked them, what are you expecting in the year ahead according to those factors that you just talked about? Overall, what we're seeing in our most recent February survey is expectations have moderated, but they're still strong. In other words, businesses are still generally optimistic. They're still looking to hire. They're still looking to invest. They still expect for revenues to be high. So overall, pretty good. And the one thing that's a little bit different for Alberta businesses versus elsewhere is they're still expecting to increase investment. That's not something that's the case elsewhere, right? So that's something that I think is unique to the prairies is that investment piece. Still
thinking about investing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Even though it's more expensive to do so, right?
Right, and I think you've thread a fine needle there as well, which was, on previous business expectation surveys, we'd seen these crazy numbers of everybody it seemed wanted to be investing, everybody it seemed wanted to be hiring. Now, the numbers still look optimistic to me, but they're not necessarily those like stratospheric numbers that we'd been seeing previously.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is COVID effects, right? So we started doing the survey at a period where business activity was really low. And so we're seeing this rebound that causes these stratospheric numbers in terms of businesses wanting to invest. And yes, they are, and it's an unambiguously positive thing, but it also comes from a very low base.
Right. So let me ask you the one question that I bet you every listener right now would ask if they could, which is, give us one insider idea that if you wanted to impress people at a party with your knowledge of the economy at the moment, what would it be?
Okay, so here's the thing. When you're an economist, you just naturally assume that everything that you have to say at a party is obviously going to be just like the most fundamental interest. Like
pork barrel futures or pork belly futures, yeah.
There's like a rapt audience that should be around you waiting with bated breath. And the fact that doesn't happen is just like continually baffling.
Right.
But, the one that I'd say is that, when we think about Alberta, we think about the Alberta economy, we invariably think about the energy sector, we think about agriculture, forestry, and resource production and resource exports. And which is why we keep talking a lot about how we need to diversify the provincial economy. But one of the things that's really come along in the last couple of years especially is manufacturing activity in the province. So if you look back over the last couple of years, the manufacturing sales has increased by about 40%, which is compared to 25 nationally. So it's a huge gap between Alberta and the rest of the country. and it's being fueled by, part of it for sure is higher cost of oil leading to higher petroleum product manufacturing output. But it's not just that. It's food processing is up by 47%. I've got machinery is up 55%, chemicals, fabricated metals, chemical production. Like there's a whole bunch of areas where Alberta manufacturers.
We're building stuff.
Yeah, we are. A
Cool.
lot of stuff.
Huh.
So that's mine. That's my fun fact.
We're building stuff.
Mine would be that economic disparities across provinces has narrowed, right? And so this was actually sparked by an interesting piece that Matt Lundy wrote. I saw it this morning. He's a great business reporter, looking at the unemployment rate kind of over the last few years. But you can see this through other measures as well. And I think it's so interesting to take ourselves back in time to 2019 and think about Alberta as such an outlier of really having these challenges, right? And now fast forward to today, and economic conditions look so much more similar.
So let's move on to that labor piece. We've circled labor challenges so many times on this podcast, but it's a real problem for businesses. Most Alberta businesses still plan to increase staffing this year, but are perhaps finding fewer and fewer people looking for work. So what's going on in the kind of employment picture in Alberta?
Well, the survey that Alicia talked about earlier, our business expectation survey, showed that within the province now, about 3 out of every 5 businesses are still having trouble finding people to work, to the extent that it's potentially affecting their ability to produce. And so it's still a big problem for sure. And so we've seen a little bit of moderation in the number of vacant jobs in the province, but not really a lot. And it's specific industries keep telling us that they have this problem. Construction is a particularly strong one. This is an area that a lot of our members and businesses have been telling us that they're having difficulty being able to meet demand because they don't have the people that are available.
Oh, yeah. I would say hospitality and retail, right? So those consumer spending direct businesses have definitely been affected as well. As far as what's kind of filling them, I mean, a couple things. One of the big ones is actually we've seen an increase in participation rates of working age women. So these are women 25 to 54, kind of what we call our prime age working years. We've seen an increase in. So there are more people working. We've got obviously population growth as well. And then the other reality is as consumer spending starts to dial back, right? As things become more expensive to buy, now to get a loan for a car, it's more expensive. We're going to see some of these job vacancies be pulled back, right? And thinking about your retail lineup at, if you've been to the mall recently, it's kind of nuts. But over time, consumers simply can't keep up with that level of spending. And so maybe they had 5 sales associates that they were looking for. They're going to dial that back to 3 as consumers start to rein in their spending because, even just for their mortgage payment, right? It's that money has to come from somewhere.
Well, and participation rates in Alberta are demonstrably higher than they are elsewhere in Canada. And that's kind of a remarkable story about Alberta specifically.
Sure.
I think in our last labor force survey update, we put out a chart that made that story very, very clear. I think Alberta's participation rate was hovering around 70%, whereas, the national rate is I want to say around the 50, low 60s, high 50s.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about that, and I think is unknown, is it's actually not so much anything to do with working age people and that kind of those prime working years that are more likely to be working in Alberta. It's actually at the older end. So presumably we have, I think, more people that are just a little bit younger and still haven't hit that tipping point of going into retirement. And so as a result, higher participation.
It'd be a hypothesis, but I think it's a little bit cultural as well. Just like, the get her done attitude in Alberta. And there does seem to be a bit of a culture of working a little bit later into life and sticking around, consulting, helping out, that sort of thing.
For sure.
But Alberta isn't doing really well nationally when it comes to wage growth, on another indicator. And this has been a bit of a frustrating story, I think, for Alberta. Wage growth is just remaining very stubbornly sluggish. So, what's happening? What's happening here?
It is an interesting story, and there are a few factors. We've kind of touched on a couple of them before. One of them is, one of the main ones is that Alberta has always had the highest wages in the country. Part of that is because of the high wages paid by oil and gas sector jobs and the labor shortages that creates and how that it creates spillover demand and spillover wage growth in other industries. And that's always been kind of part of the Alberta story. So we've had situations where our wages were well above the national average. And so we're seeing that chip away over the last few years. And I think part of the reason for this, and it's only a partial explanation, is that effectively the rest of the country is catching up to Alberta and our high wages. So we've got this, if you come and move to Alberta, you can earn 10, 15, 20% more than you could in another province, and that gap is slowly decreasing over time. So I think part of the reason is that Alberta businesses or employers may not have the same room or capacity to increase wages as some others.
Because they already had in some respects.
Yeah. In a sense. And I mean, and that's only a small partial explanation. I think part of it also too is you don't have that huge driver in the oil and gas sector that are pushing up wages every place else, and that kind of rising tide lifts all boats sort of way. And so we're not seeing that. So I think that's one of the contributing factors.
Well, and, like any discussion, I think this should be intersectional. So this is obviously very challenging for Albertans who are reporting, low income just being in kind of terrible shape. What percentage or what type of wage increase do you think will need to support those folks?
Well, I mean, the easy answer to that is that you would want to see wage growth at the very least match up with inflation, right? And so if the inflation is hovering at 5-6%, ideally that's where you would want the wage growth to be as well. For especially at the lower end of the income scale, where the impacts of inflation are the hardest or the most pronounced. The issue though is that you can't just increase wages. It's not like you can flick a switch or demand or legislate or say that, all right, we need wages to grow by 5% so that people aren't any better off or aren't any worse off, because wages can wage growth there has to be a reason for wage growth, and it's usually tied to productivity or labor demand. And so if you don't have those kinds of market signals, if the value of labor isn't going up, but the cost of labor is going up, then that just potentially leads to more inflation, because if wages increase, then prices are increasing, and if you're not delivering more value for your output, which is a very nerdy economics thing to say here, but
productivity,
and I mean it all comes back. Everything comes back to productivity at the end of the day. But so I mean, to answer the question, you would love to see wage growth match inflation at the very least, but it needs to come through fundamental economics and making sure that it's a value driven story, not just a mandated story, because otherwise then you could risk a potential inflation spiral.
I always say we need a different word for productivity, because economists mean it in almost exactly the opposite way that people in Tim Hortons mean it.
That's the weirdest thing. It really is. It's just like you're doing more with less, or same amount of output with less effort.
Right. Yeah, and therefore making more money.
Who wouldn't want that?
So I'm going to get you to channel your central bankers now at the moment and tap into their minds while we talk back to inflation for a little bit. Why do you see the Canadian Central Bank diverging from, say, the U.S. and the European Central Bank in terms of their rate decisions? What do you think the implications are of that?
Yeah, so a couple things here. So one is there has already been this divergence. So Bank of Canada has essentially said, we've done as many rates as we're going to do. Right now, we're going to put they've used the term conditional pause. So don't expect any further interest rates unless something substantial changes versus what we're expecting for this year, right? Whereas other banks, so especially the U.S. Federal Reserve, have essentially not said that. They have continued to trudge ahead, albeit not as big of rate hikes, kind of more slowly, a little bit more cautiously. I would say there is probably a reason for why we're seeing the divergence. One big one is that we are more indebted in Canada, and so it's very likely that those rates are going to have a bigger impact on Canadians just because of our housing market and that indebtedness. So I think there's a pretty good reasons for why we are seeing that divergence. But the question in my mind is, when are we going to see, especially the U.S. Federal Reserve actually take a pause as well? Because there are these other market dynamics increasingly that I think are going to make them ask the question of, have we done too much too fast? To your point of, we've never seen this many rate hikes at this speed in a year. It's hard for financial markets to respond to that. It's hard for consumers to respond to that. And so I think, we're getting to a place of let's wait and see if we've done too much, frankly.
Well, and I think we've seen some lessons in how these things really do have consequences. I mean, rate hikes were at least part of the story that led to the Silicon Valley bank collapse
sure.
and other bank,
a big part, for sure,
and other bank runs. But the U.S. Federal Reserve has actually increased rates further since then. So, a bit of a head-shaking decision for some people, but I think you've outlined some of the reasons why. One of the reasons we care about inflation is, in the macro, like we've been talking about, but we also care about it for individual people. In fact, that's probably the reason we care most about it. So in Alberta, there's been some efforts to moderate that with the Affordability Action Plan. What's your view on the goals of that and how effective it's been?
Well, I mean, the goals of that are obviously to help low-income Albertans deal with rising costs and the rising cost of living. And so the main...
And middle income, I would say, for sure.
No, you're right. And the main points of focus for the provincial government have been, the extension of the pause on the provincial gasoline tax and then the electricity rebate. And so what those two things have done is try to reduce some of the specific cost pain points for Albertans. And the reason, and you can even see the impact of this in the inflation numbers. So the most recent Alberta year-over-year inflation rate was something like 3.6%, and it was 5.2 for the national average. So that's a pretty big gap. Usually there's almost no gap or a very small gap between any provincial rate and the national one. So we are seeing price growth at a far lower level in Alberta now than we are nationally. And so from that standpoint, what the province has done is provide some money to lower some specific costs for Albertans. And so it's been effective at doing that, and you can see the impact in the inflation numbers.
So my last question on inflation is, normally when interest rates go up, you expect consumer spending to decrease. It seems like we're not seeing that. How do you explain it?
Yeah, I think I would qualify not yet, and that's very firmly what the Bank of Canada is saying, is that
we've still got some room on our credit cards.
We've still got some room, but not for much longer. And so so their own expectations see economic growth really slowing the rest of this year, simply because you can try to keep pace for a while, right, with honestly racking up credit card debt and other measures. But after a while, I think consumers are going to really have to rein it in, and we'll see that play out in the economic growth numbers for sure. But I still think there's a little bit of this catch up, and the Bank of Canada talked about it, of wanting to do the things that we simply haven't been able to do over the last few years in terms of travel and getting together with friends and all these things. So that's the spending where I think it's going to take a little bit longer to see that level off.
So let's talk a little bit more about some of the more long-term implications of what you're seeing happening economically. You pulled out a couple things in the snapshot, one being housing affordability. We've just got so many people moving to the province, and we need to make sure that there is homes for those people, but that's going to be kind of a big challenge over the long term to ensure that the folks who are moving here have a place to live and a job to do and have the resources they need to thrive. So what else are you seeing in terms of the long term implications?
Well, I think that housing one you just mentioned is a really important one, and that's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about here. So you've got a couple of things going on. One is a huge influx of people moving into Alberta from other provinces that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 quarters. And then on top of that, Canada has this new policy to attract up to the target of 500,000 immigrants coming into the country, which is a huge increase from what we've seen before. And so the issue that we see is that there's this huge population boom in Alberta. We want to get our share of those immigrants, or as many as possible, because we have the labor shortages and skills shortages that we've talked about before. More people means a healthier, and a thriving economy. But these people need a place to live. Like everybody who lives here needs. And so the population growth that we're seeing is far outstripping our ability to produce new housing stock to put these people in, and to put anybody in. So this is if we keep seeing this kind of gap between housing supply and housing demand, it's going to keep prices from falling here. It's going to cause an increase in prices compared to what we're seeing in other parts of the country. And that could potentially erode our ability to attract people to come to Alberta. So I think that this focus on housing, this focus on making sure that we can find places for everyone to live, affordable places for everyone to live, that's something that really needs to be a priority.
So as we look to wrap, we're going to do lightning round, and I'm going to ask you to predict the future on several fronts. You love lightning round.
I hate lightning round.
We're going to do 2 more of these this year, and so I'm going to ask you to predict the future of what we're going to be talking about then. By the time we sit down in another 3 months, do you think Bank of Canada interest rate Up, down, or about the same as it is today?
About the same for me.
Yeah, I think the same.
Oil prices,
Higher.
Lower.
Uh-oh.
home prices.
Up.
Yep.
And what's the one factor, if I only let you watch one thing for the next 3 months on the Alberta economy, what's the first thing you're going to be pulling up?
That's a good question. I don't know. Like when you started talking, I honestly was going to go with some sort of geopolitical answer and about uncertainty outside of the country and outside of the province, but then you veered off into Alberta specifically. So
Wage growth.
Wage growth?
actually, yeah, that's a good one. I'll go with that too.
Okay. So we've got a few markers down. We'll have to check back in 3 months. Thanks, folks.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.